All right, so another unplanned live. I'm making these a regular habit. And I'm finding that topics can kind of vary. So I'm noticing, so one of the things I try to do is I try to pay attention to a trend on what is either being watched or commented on my channel as far as picking what topic to talk about. And in many cases, I'm really not sure what's trending. Now, of course, my last live that I did, I actually had a plan for, but I started talking into the microphone for 30 minutes, not realizing that it said to start the stream instead of end the stream. Typically, when I do these, I've been doing them unplanned, where I just kind of do them at random. Hey, Jay Woodwolf, good to see you. I hope you were doing well. I know you were going through a very hard time right now, and I completely understand that. When I was trying to do the one last week, I had it planned, I had it scheduled, and when I started it, apparently there's something extra I need to do. Like right now, today, I just hit start streaming, instantly connected it, which is what I expected it to do last week. So that's why I wasted a half hour. So people probably showed up for 2 and didn't have me here to speak. My main goal with a lot of these lives is to start having discussions in the chat with other individuals with feedback, kind of directing the conversation. I had thought many times about going back to just making videos. I make the occasional short, and I do make the occasional video, but I don't do it as regular as I used to. And I think that's for a combination of reasons. One of the reasons is just for the simple fact that a lot of the things that I read about were out of books, and a lot of those books are just repeating the same type of stuff, and then you have a moment, and I think a lot of people have faced this before, where you start questioning a lot of what you read. Like, how accurate was it? What are their sources? Where did they get it from? That's why I've been digging into a lot more sources lately. Recent conversations have been a little bit more focused that I was having on TikTok. It has been a little bit more focused on some of the, I guess a lot of people are calling it Norse paganism, which I'm not a fan of. And if you've watched my videos, you understand why I'm not a fan of it. But a lot of the Scandinavian practices. And one of the reasons for that is you're now having that stuff a little bit more accessible because of the big boom from TV shows like Vikings, that people are now starting to get interested in it. And one of the discussions I was having is with someone who actually does, he's a lay scholar. He does philology and stuff. And he was talking about Volva and witch basically being the same thing. That's how you would translate that. And this got us talking about stuff like how Ursula Dronka takes the word seidr and translates that into magic. So we've been going back and forth a little bit, but basically I'm saying no, that's not the case. And I'm noticing this trend that witch seems to be the catch-all for folks. Like, oh, they're a Nordic witch, or they're an Irish witch, a Polish witch, Slavic witch, Italian witch. And this insistence on always going to the word witch to be some form of magical practitioner, I think, skews a lot of the views on what each of those individual unique cultural traditions are. When you take a word and find something close to it, and you see this a lot with indigenous tribes. I knew one individual who was Shawnee. He was part of the Shawnee Nation, and apparently he has family that came from Ireland, and then they married into the Shawnee, and he's both Shawnee and Irish. And part of his tribe is they don't have a name for who typically Americans would call a shaman. The term shaman comes from Siberia. That's actually what shaman are. They're Siberian base. I mean, you can kind of basically say priest-like people, but shaman is regional. And they tend to dismiss this and label anyone as part of a group, clan, or tribe as being the shaman of that group. The indigenous people did not have shamans. Another term you'll hear is medicine men, because that's what English speakers are using. How's it going? I know, Rocky. Good to see you. Welcome. That's what English speakers are labeling these people as. But when I was talking to my friend, who again, who's part of the Shawnee Nation, he said that they didn't really have a name for it. Like, their tribe or clan is basically a close-knit group. Everybody knew each other. They knew what sort of talents or abilities that people had. They knew who went out and did the hunting and gathering. They knew who were craftsmen. They knew who the spiritual people were. And he said the closest people for his tribe was pipe maker. That's the closest word that can be translated into English as pipe maker. Not shaman, not medicine man, but pipe maker. Because the individual who was spiritual, there was a sacredness to pipes for his tribe. And the smoke is very representative of spirituality. That's why you see stuff like sage, right? When people burn white sage and they're smoking and they're, wow, I don't know why I cannot remember the word off the top of my head. When people, smudging, the smudging technique, people will typically take a bundle of sage, burn it, and walk it around their house. But if you've seen indigenous people use it, they'll put it in a bowl, they'll burn it, and they'll take like feathers, and they will waft it in the direction of what they are cleansing with that smoke. The smoke is very sacred. We have images of people using like peace pipes and stuff like that because, again, there's a sacredness there. So the individual who was spiritual also happened to be the one who crafted the pipes in his particular tribe. So he didn't have a name like shaman or whatever. He wouldn't be the witch of the village, so to speak, right? It would be the individual who just did the spiritual stuff. And I think that people take out of context that their culture in our modern society has a large reflection on what we do and what we know. And when you simply say that a vulva is a witch, you are reducing, you are dismissing, and you are taking out all the cultural nuances that makes those individual paths. And this was part of my response to this person. Hey, the camera is really good this time. On unrelated note, did you see Tucker Carlson interviewing Putin? I did not. And yeah, at the moment, well, I'm still getting some frame drops because for whatever reason, the internet seems to cut out quite often, which is frustrating, but it is what it is. So I'm going to have to work with it until I either get a new service provider or I figure out some way, I guess, of lowering the bit rate or quality of the stream in order to get it to not cut out and be so jerky or jumpy so much. So hopefully watching this in the playback that's not live will be easier. I am not getting any lags on my end. Good to know. Thank you for letting me know that. The Kaliak was woman who did not be a part of society. She lived outside the villages, isolated. That is Kaliak, right? I thought that's going into some of the Druidry stuff. The Kaliak, who is usually referred to as the crone. She is a figure, typically, I think, associated with supernatural powers, such as death and rebirth, I thought. And I thought we typically see her or about her around Samhain and Hahauna, if I'm not mistaken. If you're referring to the same being that I'm thinking of, but you're saying it almost like a title. Feel free to expound upon that. But that also kind of reinforces my point, depending on the society that you're talking about. Like even Druidry, like Druidry can technically be from Gaul, can be French, right? It can be from Ireland, it can be from Wales, could be from England, even in Britain. And the way that Druidry would practice is going to be mildly different. Even the term Druid itself is a modern term, as you well know. It's not what they used to call themselves back then. If you look up dictionary definitions of a lot of these words, they'll reference other ones like sorcerer and witch and wizard. They'll list them all out and they'll say basically they're all the same thing. But it dismisses all of what they actually do. To me, this is similar to saying, hey, they practice religion. So a priest, a rabbi, and a monk are the exact same, right? Jewish rabbi and a Catholic priest, exact same thing. And since a lot of people will, in modern times, will take witches, for example, and some witches also practice Wicca, and Wiccans have a tendency to call themselves high priests and high priestesses. So if they're priests, then they're the exact same thing as a Jewish rabbi and a Catholic priest, right? Because they're all religious people. That's not the case. They're very uniquely and distinctly different. And when people try to reduce and summarize and dismiss the nuances, they cause confusion with people looking. That's why I think a lot of people are starting to use these old names not knowing what they are. We don't know what the vulva were. We know about what the vulva were done what it was capable of. It basically means staff carrier. It was always a woman. And we have some sagas where they describe in great detail some of the things that they wore. And they usually did seither, which is a type of magic, but not magic. And the reason I make that distinction, Ursula Dronka translates seither, because it's not a D, it's an F, which is like it pronounces like a TH. But seither, we see that there was ritualistic things done, and it was specifically done by women and women only. And they have examples of Volva coming to speak, and I think in Eric the Red saga, and she is looking for other women who knows the songs, the Gulder, which is like a magic spell or a way of speaking. So to me, seither would be this specific type of ritual that was done by women or men who were unmasculine, versus Gulder, or working with runes, or Taufer, or different things that I personally would call Fjolkingi. I was having a conversation about that too, that Fjolkinging just means much knowing, and you can be talented or skillful and all much stuff doesn't necessarily apply to magic. But I think, again, you're taking the context of what we see and identify. Today, when we say the term magic, what do we typically think of? We think of stage magic, we think of high fantasy, we think of games and whatnot, right? So people will think of like wizards throwing fireballs, or disappearing or flying or things like that. But you don't have references to people throwing fireballs or lightning bolts and stuff in the Eddas and sagas, because it's a different culture, it's a different group. So to take a word and translate it, you're losing the meaning. You have to take the context of where you're taking it out of. Even like what you're saying here with the Kaliak, with a woman living outside of society. That type of role, if it's a title and a role, is what you're getting at. It's not going to be the same thing as a spiritual individual of an indigenous tribe, or a spiritual individual of one of the Anglo-Saxon clans, or a spiritual individual of today in like one of the Catholic societies, a priest versus a monk. Each of these individuals are going to have very unique, distinctive things. So I don't think it translates directly when you take a word that means something very specific. Again, Volva, we know things about specifically being women staff carriers, and we have examples of them. To say that that's the same thing as a witch would be to say that if somebody went and studied witchcraft today, they can just call themselves Volva. It's the same thing, but it's not. In fact, even the root and origin of the word witch, going back to Old Anglo-Saxon language, Old English, right? We have witcha and witche. We have a male and female. We have books of them writing things down in Old English that claim some of the healing rituals they have written down are part of the witcha or the witche. And we don't know for sure, because it wasn't a group that stayed in existence that we can trace back and say, yep, this is an unbroken line to the past, it is what it is. We have reconstruction. We have reconstruction everywhere. And I think a lot of people start pulling from different traditions when they reconstruct. I have argued this in many of my different videos before, that a lot of what people say is witchcraft today is in fact Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, Hinduism, and Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It's an accumulation of a whole bunch of different practices. And I can make references to books written in the 1800s and the 1900s, early 1900s. 1900 should not be that long ago, but it really is. It was 24 years ago. That talk about some of the ritual ceremonies and magic that is used today that people consider part of witchcraft. But we can see its origin in other things as well. So is it that these books learned from the old witches? That's possible. Or it's possible that the modern witch has taken and collected the knowledge that they have available at their fingertips and reconstructed something else based upon what little remained, which I think is the more likely scenario. So again, if you're looking into traditions and you're looking into rebuild and recollect things, knowing where things come from and keeping them separate, know the culture you're pulling it from. I see this in a lot of the folk traditions of Chinese folk traditions, like Taoism, right? And different types of, again, Chinese folk traditions. People will say, oh, qi. Qi is life force. It's not. Prana, ki, and qi are not the same thing. And a lot of people will tell you they are. Sorry. Gotta always have lovely coughs. anymore when I'm streaming and whatnot. So in Hinduism, you have prana, which they typically say is like a life force. And in Japan, you have ki, which is like your warrior fighting spirit in a way. And then in China, you have qi, qi, qi. And that's supposed to be this life force as well. And they try to say they're the same thing, but if you don't understand the culture they're coming from and the way that they view them, you won't understand the bigger picture. Looking at it from a Western perspective, we're not ever going to have the same understanding as someone who was born and raised in China, especially someone who's studied old Chinese philosophy. It's going to be a different perspective. Qi roughly translates into English by many as breath, and that gives you a different perspective and a different view on it. Instead of calling it life force, it's one of the vital forces that makes up who you are. I've heard of three main energies when I started studying Chinese folk traditions because of my martial arts interest: Qi, Jing, and Shen. Jing is like your physical body. Qi is your breath, and it's a type of energy that runs through you along your meridians that moves with your breath and goes through your organs and gives it nourishment from a spiritual level. And Jing is more like your physical body and your blood flow. So they kind of work together, but they're kind of different aspects, but they're both a type of life force. Qi is not specifically your life force. One of my teachers, one of my shifu, specifically said Qi doesn't leave your body. Other people will make claims that they're projecting their Qi, but if you look at the third energy I mentioned, Shen is something that radiates from you. Jing is something you're born with that's finite. Qi is something you develop and can grow. And by working on your Jing and Qi through martial arts and exercise, such as Tai Chi Chuan, meditation, different things like that, you can then radiate more Shen energy. So Shen would be something that leaves. But again, this whole concept of using Qi like people think of using psychic energy isn't the same thing, because people cross those streams. If you don't look at the culture, if you don't look at the way that they view it, you're going to get a skewed version of it. And a lot of people do that. And I think they intentionally skew it sometimes to sell books. Hello, I'm glad that I managed to happen on here. Hello, Angus McWerther. Welcome to the live. Hopefully you're enjoying it. Feel free to jump in. This is meant to be an open conversation. Right now, I'm just prattling on about recent conversations that I've had and discussing about how translating from one language to another we can lose meaning, especially when we take named individuals such as Volva and Witch and say they're the same thing without having the context and the nuances of the culture and society that they come from. But it doesn't have to stay on that topic, so feel free to direct the conversation in whatever interests you. And this goes for anyone watching now or later. Feel free to jump into the comments or into the chat and just have an open discussion to things that are interesting to you, and we will drive the conversation in that direction. Preferably sticking with a more modern spiritual nature than jumping into politics or talking about games, even though I do like those conversations. For this particular one, I was hoping to stick with a more historical namesake theme, but doesn't mean it has to stay locked there. Wait for a few moments so people feel like they can jump in. I have a tendency to just talk. Unscripted conversation I do find enjoyable at times. I like to prattle on. That's why I started doing some of these lives, but having the advantage of having a conversation and possibly having a discourse also seems appealing. So, like I said, feel free to jump in. Okay, I will move on for now. But yeah, talking about the different cultural differences. It's so when I was earlier mentioning about magic and Seidr, and even though you have people who will claim Seidr translates into magic, the concept of magic as we see it today, I don't think exists in old Scandinavia. You had different techniques and practices that would fall under a large umbrella category like magic, and I don't think Seidr works that way for Scandinavia. I don't think you can take all of the different words that were associated with different types of magic and say they were all Seidr magic. Spow, which is like foretelling and future telling, Sure, it was practiced within Seidr, but I think it could be practiced outside of Seidr as well. Golder, as I'd mentioned, we have examples in the sagas and Eddas of men using spells and chanting. Sometimes they would carve runes and chant over the runes. An example of that is Eetssaga. Skallagrimsson was invited by a rival, and they gave him a drink, and he carved runes into the table and spoke over them, which I would equate to Golder, even though it doesn't specifically call it out as Golder. And the cup basically shattered, and he knew it was poison, so he pulled out his weapon and slaughtered him and his wife for trying to poison him. And it was actually poisoned. But that's an example. But if Seidr is all magic in Scandinavia, then technically what he did was not only Seidr, not Galdr, but he's ergi, unmasculine, because he's practicing a woman's craft, a woman's art. And I just don't think that's the case. Unfortunately, I often get lost in translation. I could always take a class in another language. Luckily, I have learned a lot of Latin roots in my education. Still doesn't translate a lot. Right. One of the things, since we're specifically talking about the North Scandinavian stuff and some of the sagas and Eddas, now, I'm trying to look at other stuff. Like I've been looking into Mabinogion, which is like some of the English tales dealing with some of the stuff along the idea of druidry or druidism. It draws a lot of inspiration from some of those tales. Looking at the way that they viewed how magic worked, like Kai. There is a tale in the Mabinogion, and oh, cool! That was a neat transition. I thought it just flipped over to the other scene. It kind of like faded in between them. So in here, it talks about Kai's abilities, which I just think is awesome. Okay, maybe they spelled it Kai this way. Oh, they did spell it Kai this way. This is the way I prefer to spell Kai. If you haven't read the Mabinogion, I highly recommend it. But there's a part in here where it talks about Kai's powers as an example, which is awesome. Let's see, thereupon raise potentially breath. There we go. This section right here. Thereupon Kai rose up. Kai had this peculiarity that his breath lasted 9 nights and 9 days underwater, and he could exist 9 nights and 9 days without sleep. A wound from Kai's sword no physician could heal. Very subtle was Kai. When it pleased him, he could render himself as tall as the highest tree in the forest. And he had another peculiarity. So great was the heat of his nature that when it rained hardest, whatever he carried remained dry for a handbreadth above and handbreadth below his hand. And when his companions were coldest, it was to them as fuel with which to light their fire. So it's basically giving what we would typically consider magical properties to Kai, which Kai is awesome, by the way. But it doesn't talk about, he doesn't call it magic. It doesn't specifically say he's casting spells, but he has the ability to do these feats. It doesn't even say how he goes about doing them, but it has these abilities that we would typically associate with high fantasy fiction and whatnot, but it does it in its own subtle way. Looking at stuff like this gives you some perspective to how the people that this comes from thought about magic. I was also looking at, speaking of translation, so this is a translation. The Mabinogion here is translated in English, and sometimes I'll notice that the different translations will word things slightly differently. So knowing how and where to find them, I think makes a difference too, which, by the way, I'll go ahead and share this link in case you want to read a version of the Mabinogion, because I love sharing references. You know me. Laura Perry, hey, yeah, finally caught you when you're on. Yes. By the way, hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the live. Nice to have you. Feel free to jump into the conversation. This was an unplanned live, as you can see, just an open conversation. Started out with a recent conversation I had on TikTok talking about vulva and witch being the same thing and how I disagree and why. Then I kind of dug into sources and talking about the way that people look at stuff. A lot of people don't realize that the term magic itself actually comes from Persia, comes from Zoroastrianism. And you can look this up and confirm it yourself, but if you look up the Zoroastrian priests, the Magoi, M-A-G-O-I, I think that's how it's spelled and pronounced. I could be wrong in the pronunciation. That eventually evolved into Magi or Magi or Magi. and eventually became magic. The way we think and look at magic and supernatural forces today is much different than the cultures we attempt to emulate with modern reconstruction. And that's why I think it's important to go back to old sources like this. And this particular one that I'm sharing on the screen right now is a translation of the Mabinogion. And this is one of the stories where Kai, and I was mentioning Kai because I just think Kai is fantastic. Listening to some of his abilities here, this reads like you would classify as magic, but it's not called magic. And it also doesn't say how he does it. Like even this heat, him having this heat on his body to keep things dry and to be able to light fires. Like I don't know if they're saying light fires with his body heat, which I think that's what they mean, or if they mean he can keep kindling dry so they can use it for fires later, which it could also be read that way as well. But the translation of these gets rough. Another one that I was recently looking at was the sagas. So specifically, this is called Skuldskaparmal, and Skuldskaparmal does a combination of things. So sacred text is the last thing that I shared. This combines sacred text translations, but it also includes on the right-hand side the Old Icelandic, the Old Norse, and I think this is fascinating. Now, my Icelandic is rough. I'm not fluent. I'm trying to learn because, well, my mom was born in Iceland and it's important to me. But you can see here on the right-hand side, this is section 43. So you've heard of Mjölnir, right? Thor's hammer. This is where it got created, even though it's not called Mjölnir. And I have actually had debates over the meaning of this with other individuals who have read this as well. And it's fascinating to listen to the different ways this gets translated. But looking here at this on the right, this is Av Smíðum Ivoldi Sonna och Sindra Dvegs. And they translate this as about the smith, the son of Ivaldi, and about the dwarf Sindri. So, the smith, Ivaldi's son of Ivaldi, and Sindra Dvegs. Dvegs, it should be Dveg, not Dvegs, is a dwarf. That's what they call dwarfs, which is also translates into black elves. It's interesting to see and hear these translations. So again, looking at the two different stories makes it interesting as well. But this goes over all. I was looking at a TikTok where someone was making the claim that Mjolnir was supposed to be it was supposed to be a warhammer. I thought he said two-handed hammer because a lot of people say that. Neil Gaiman did Norse mythology and he kind of elaborated on a lot of things and filled it with extra stuff as a talented writer. He's a great writer, but he's added to this. This is the story. This is how it was created and forged. And it doesn't say anything here about it needing to be a two-handed hammer. In fact, if you look at Scandinavian weaponry, you have shields, swords, axes, knives, two-handed axes, spears, and bows and arrows. You don't have warhammers, clubs, or maces as your traditional Scandinavian weapons. And that's to say that they don't have clubs or staves or other things as well. But a warhammer is not mentioned and hasn't been found in grave finds. So Mjolnir is unique in that way, that it's described as being almost like a weapon. This describes the properties of it. There is a section in here. So in a nutshell, to kind of summarize the saga here, which you can go read for yourself, Loki is supposed to basically go harass the Jotnar with Oðinn. I'm sorry, not Oðinn. Yeah, with Thor. Thor leaves without him and he's bored, and apparently he's going and he's cutting off all of Siv's hair. So Siv is a Vanir, which is one of the tribes of the deities, the pantheon in Scandinavia and the Norse Scandinavian type stuff. And she is associated with harvest and wheat, and she's always depicted as having long golden hair. So this is like, why is gold called Siv's hair? You know, Kve gul kallet hadir Sivjar. And Loki, Laufrson, for mischief's sake, cut off all Siv's hair. Loki, Laufrson, havði það gert til Leivissi at klippa har alt av Siv. I'm not going to read both of them back and forth side by side, but it basically goes into what he did. Thor was pissed, kind of punched and broke the wall next to his head. It was going to break every bone in his body. So he goes to the black elves, the dwarves, the Dvevgar, and he asks them to make a wig. While he's there, he gets two other gifts made, and he starts mouthing off the broker. and saying, I bet your brother Sindri can't make things as nice as this. And like, oh, you want to bet? So he crafts 3 items, one of which is a hammer. And there's a fly that keeps stinging Brokkr as he's working the bellows. It stings his hand, his neck, and his eyelid. And that's this last section here. Then Sindri laid iron in the hearth and bade him blow, saying it would be spoiled if the blast failed. Straightway the fly settled between Brokkr's eyes and stung his eyelid. But when the blood fell into his eyes so that he could not see, then he clutched at it with his hand as swiftly as he could, while the bellows grew flat. And he swept the fly from him. Then the smith came thither, which would be Sindri, because he's the one who's smithing the stuff, and said that it had come near to spoiling all that was in the hearth. When he took from the forge a hammer, put all the precious works into the hands of Brokkr his brother, bade him go with them to Asgard and claim the wager. Then down here, basically, Oðinn and Freyr, Oðinn and Thor are sitting in judgment. They're all getting a gift. They get 3 gifts from Loki and 3 gifts from Brokkr, who they then judge these gifts. And this is where we get mjölnir, which is, the swaying one, the spear that always hits its target that Oðinn has. There's other gifts too, but right here. Then he gave the hammer to Thor, and said that Thor might smite as hard as he desired, whatever so might be before him, and the hammer would not fail. And if he threw it at anything, it would never miss, and never fly so far as to not return to his hand. And if be desired, he might keep it in his sark. It was so small. But indeed it was a flaw in the hammer, that the forehaft was somewhat short. So this part here is the part that gets kind of iffy, and this is where I've tried to look over here on the side. So knowing a little bit about Icelandic, I can kind of find the part where they're talking about. Thou gav han Thor hamurinn ok sagði is the part where we're talking about he gave the hammer to Thor, because, again, knowing just a little bit about it. But then there's this part here when they're talking about the haft being short. That's this part here. En það var li á forsikti var helder skjönt, which is like basically the fire shaft, or the shaft is short on the hammer, basically. So if it's short, some people read this as it was intended to be a 2-handed warhammer. However, if you look at a lot of Mjolnir pendants, I don't wear my Mjolnir pendant as much anymore. I can get into that later if you want to know why. Mostly because I'm getting frustrated with other people that wear it. But if you look at your typical symbol of Mjolnir, here's another one for example and reference. I never wear this one. This is the one that I wear when I wear a Mjolnir at all, because it's part of my people. But this is one that they found in Sweden. It's based upon it. It's a design. You can see how short that handle is. So I kind of read it like this is a super short hammer, which is almost unusable, versus it's supposed to be 2-handed. I think it's just supposed to be long enough to be 1-handed. But the person I was speaking with, we were debating on the translation that maybe he thinks it's supposed to be a 2-handed warhammer. I'm like, they didn't use warhammers. So why is it a 2-handed warhammer? And then having a hammer period as a basic weapon is kind of confusing. I better close this down and switch back over so I can read chat. Because if y'all are commenting, I'd love to hear your impressions and interpretations. Hey, Louie, how's it going? Yay! And you like hearing about this stuff, so you came in just time. Okay, so nobody is speaking yet, which is fantastic. But feel free to jump in if you find this interesting and share your thoughts. So my main point that I'm trying to get to here is looking at original sources. You get a different feel and context for how they do stuff. When they create these weapons, these are Dvevgar, right? Dwarves, the black elves, are said to live inside rocks. How do they get inside those rocks? They kind of walk into them. Even today in Iceland, if there's a boulder they think might have some of the Huldufólk, the hidden people, inside of it, like an Elfer, which is an elf, or a Dvevgar, which is a dwarf, they won't disturb the rock. They'll build roads and stuff around it. Construction is stopped for this. My cousin has a big boulder in her basement that cuts off part of her basement. She won't remove it because there might be something living inside the boulder. This concept and the way that we view that is much different than the rest of the society in the world. Like, we have a different idea of what it's able to do, and the way that we look at the Fae or the fair folk, right? The hidden folk of Ireland, for example, the fairies. we have a very different view on them, that they live in this other plane and they live under in mounds. And that's how you get into Tir na Nog, right? The land of the dead and stuff where they reign. And if they do come up, you can keep them at bay with stuff like iron, because they hate iron for whatever reason. So iron will repel them and stuff. So we have these different view of them versus these other beings from this other culture. So if you try to say it's the same across cultures, you lose the context and the richness of those individual cultures. So looking at their stories and the way that they did stuff, I think is a great way to find inspiration and to start your journey. I do have it up while I wait for my friends to get here. Cool. What, in your opinion, what is the best book for Thor and Loki? I don't know if there's a best book. I would actually go back to the old sagas and eddas. I would look up. So we have a skald, which is, again, similar to a poet. I won't say it's the same thing. I won't say a skald and a bard are the same thing. But you have skalds, and there is one named Snorri Sturluson. And if you look up the prose Edda and the poetic Edda, those two are great starting sources to learn more about both Loki and Thor. Like that story that I just gave you right there is Skaldskaparmal. And Skaldskaparmal, it goes into great detail about the forging of Thor's hammer, Mjölnir, which is awesome. Now, it doesn't call it Mjölnir. It just says hammer, but it's pretty clear what he's talking about there. So definitely give you some neat perspective to read about how they wrote about them in the olden days. There's also, if you want to see some old pictures, check this out. This is one of the older pictures I can find of Thor and Oðinn. And I think Loki's in here too. You can pronounce it Loki, but Loki, it would be how you would say it in Icelandic. So I like to collect old texts and PDFs and stuff, and there is a lot of them online. Iceland is really cool about sharing their stuff. And there is a book, and it has beautiful artwork. I think it's from the 15th century, and it's got the artwork for how they viewed. See, I thought it would be right in here. I usually say, I'm looking through my notes, that's why I'm taking a minute, because I like to re-reference this stuff quite often. It should be under Sagas and Eddas. Let me go up here to Icelandic. See, now this is all reading for Icelandic stuff. Secrets of the Rest, Wiki1, second edition. No, that's not the book I'm looking for. I don't think it's under Prose Edda. This is the sacred text ones. This is the Value Spouse. This is the birth of Oðinn. This is a really good one. Gylfaginning, which talks about like the creation story, and it talks about how you have Gunungagap, the land between ice and fire, Muspelheim and Niflheim, and how they came together and melted and creation happened, and how it spilled out poisonous fumes, and Ymir came out, and then a cow came out and licked out Odin's grandfather, which is, again, fascinating stories and stuff to read. This is Skaldskaparmal, Value Spot, Poetic Edda. Poem, Thor engages in a heated argument over which is the stronger and wiser. Oh, yeah. That'll give you an interesting perspective on Oðinn. And this is the Hold manuscript, but that's not the one I want. Books. Maybe it's under this section. Yes, Psalm 66. This is what I'm looking for right here. So let me pull this up. And I will send you a link so you can look up the artwork yourself. So this is a manuscript from Iceland, and it has some imagery inside of it. Let me share my screen. Okay, so this is like, it says Edda on the front cover. This is, again, this is online. It's free. You can check it out. So you have to go for a while before you get to the pictures. I think this is from the 15th century. You can look it up. It looks like it says Sam 66. That A with the accent makes an ow sound. So it's Psalm 66, not Sam 66. I think I can jump ahead pretty far to get to the artwork section. You may have seen these before, but this is the book they actually come out of. I don't think it's that far in there, is it? I should have kept references to the images. Yeah, I don't think it's that far. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this would be one of the goats. This is that cow, and this is Ymir. This is either Ymir or it's Odin's father, and actually it's probably Odin's father because the cow's licking him out of the ice. If you look up that, so there's Beri, who basically had Bor, and Bor had Oðinn and his brothers Vili and Ve. So this is the cow, and the cow, I gotta look up the name because I can never remember how to pronounce it. It's Auðhumlu. Yeah, Auðhumlu. There's a picture of the cow. Let me send you a link real quick. Because again, I like links. Who doesn't like links? Yeah, it looks really cool. It's definitely some cool stuff. I'll get back to chat in just a second here. Hold on. So Psalm 66. So there's the cow. I forget who this is supposed to be here. So this is Oðinn here on the right-hand side. Interesting look for a sword, especially because of the time period. But you can see right up here, it says Oðinn, and it also says heathen and mjölnir, his ravens. So that is Oðinn. And this is Thor, and you can see his belt of strength because he had a belt that helped him with his hammer. So there's his hammer. Now that's a much longer haft on that hammer than it seems like is in the stories, but that is a picture of Thor. And I think over here on the right-hand side, this is Loki. Fairly certain this is Loki. Could be wrong, but I think that's Loki. So yeah, really cool imagery in this book. This is that story that you've heard before. This is Thor, and remember when he's fishing for the world serpent? And this is also on a stone. They put this in here as well. That's how we know that this is Thor and a depiction of him. So that's pretty neat. It's such a neat book. Looking at these old books, this would be a good one, but obviously if you were going to go through this, you would need a translation of it. So this is Psalm 66 as a possible resource for you. I don't know why it's doing that trade transition when I switch between scenes, but I like it. That's actually pretty cool. It looks professional. It's like, hey, look, I know what I'm doing. No, I really don't. I just kind of get on here and chat for people to listen and discuss things with me. Let's see what I missed. Thank you, taking notes. Absolutely, absolutely. And sacredtext.com and valuespa.org. Let me grab you those links really quick too. These are great places to read online. Valuespa.org is nice because it gives you the Icelandic as well as the English translation, where Sacred Text will only give you the English translation. But on here, there's a lot of great stories. And they're poetic, right? They are read with poetry, so it gives you a different look on it. Now, trying to find the ones that mention them, I don't have a full list of all of the different ones that mention them. But for example, 43 in Valuespal, Skoldskaparmál. Skoldskaparmál is this one right here. And I think I gave the link earlier, I think, for the 43 is what you want. But this is, so saga means story. And in this one here, you will have mention of Loki, and you will have mention of Thor. Both how Thor reacts, as well as how he receives the gift and how he judges it. So this gives you a good feel for what Loki is like, right? Why is gold called Sif's hair? Loki Laufeyrisson, for mischief's sake, cut off Sif's hair. But when Thor learned of this, he seized Loki and would have broken every bone in him had he not sworn to get the black elves to make Sif's hair of gold, such that it would grow like other hair. After that, Loki went to those dwarves who are called Ivaldi's sons. So you can see here, the mischief behind Loki, and just he does stuff just to do it. And Thor acts with rage and anger and violence when he gets set off. He is quick to his temper comes out quickly, and you see it in the other sagas and Eddas as well. Then Loki wagered his head with the dwarf called Brokr that Brokr's brother Sindri could not make 3 other precious things equal in virtue to these. So this just shows Loki causing more mischief. He's just supposed to go there and get the hair. Nope, can't do that. He's got to mouth off to a dwarf and bet his head on it. So what happens when he loses the bet? Because he loses the bet. Now, when he and Loki brought forward the precious gifts, he is talking about Brokr, because we jump past the part where he forges his 3 gifts. The Aesir sat down in the seats of judgment, and that verdict to prevail which Oðinn, Thor, and Freyr should render. Then Loki gave Oðinn the spear Mjölnir, and to Thor the hair which Siv was to have, and Skidblathnir to Freyr, which is a boat that always catches good wind and you can fold it up and put it in your pocket, and told the virtues of all these things, that the spear would never stop in its thrust, the hair would grow to the flesh as soon as it came upon Siv's head, and Skidblathnir would have a favoring breeze as soon as the sail was raised in whatever direction it might go, but could be folded together like a napkin and be kept in Freyr's... Yeah, I forgot it mentions this part for the gifts. So he gives all this stuff. They do all their things, right? Then this is where Brokr is giving out his 3 gifts, which is a boar with golden bristles, a Draupnir, which is a ring that multiply itself every couple of nights to basically make Oðinn rich. And then he gives the hammer to Thor, and said that Thor might smite as hard as he desired, whatever so might be before him, and the hammer would not fail. And it talks about the powers of Mjolnir. Then you go down to this section. They all decided the hammer was the best out of all of them. Then Loki offered to redeem his head, right? So we now know that Loki's lost. But the dwarf said that there was no chance of this. So Loki's saying, wait a minute. I know I bet my head, let me keep it. The dwarf's like, nope, give me your head. Loki, let's see, so said there was no chance of this. Take me then, quoth Loki. So Loki's like, come and get me. But when Brokr would have laid hands on him, he was a long way off. So he just vanished from his grasp. Loki had with him those shoes with which he ran through air and over water. Then the dwarf prayed Thor to catch him, and Thor did so. So this shows you, Loki's like, wait a minute, let me keep my head. Let's make another bet. And when he says no, Loki's like, screw that, I'm not letting you collect. And Thor, wanting to uphold the wager, grabbed Loki. Now, Loki, a lot of people, like in Marvel, they say Loki and Oðinn are brothers. They're not. Loki is actually blood brothers with Oðinn. So it's more like an uncle to Thor. Something to keep in mind. Not a lot of people know that. Thor is also the daughter of Njord, which is like the earth. It's a Jotun. It's a giantess. Is Thor's mother, not Freya or Frigg. Frigg is not Thor's mother, which is interesting too. You'll learn all about this in these sagas and Eddas, by the way. So I always say go back to these original sources. Even if you read the translation, they're so much better. Jackson Crawford, write that name down. Dr. Jackson Crawford has a YouTube channel, and he has books, great translations of a lot of these stories. Then the dwarf try to catch him. Thor did. Then the dwarf would have hewn off his head, but Loki said that he might have the head, but not the neck. So the dwarf took a thong and a knife and would have bore a hole in Loki's lips and stitched his mouth together, but the knife did not cut, showing you how powerful these beings are. Then Brokr said it would be better if his brother's owl were there. So, like, it's a tool. And even as he named it, the owl was there and pierced the lips. He stitched the ups together, and Loki ripped the thong out of the edges. The thong with which Loki's mouth was sewn together is called Vartari. So if you look up images of Loki, he's like this barreled, he's like this giant, and he's like hunched over and his lips are stitched shut. Let me see if I can find an image really quick. You might have seen it before, but for people jumping in, as you can tell, I get kind of excited about this stuff. I know I have an image. Might want to look through my images from when I went to the Viking exhibit at the museum. I don't know if I can find it, but anyway, you'll see this like rounded, hunched over figure, and his lips are shown. So that's why, because he was mouthing off and he caused trouble. But yeah, this is the type of stuff you can learn if you look through some of these. I'm not obviously going to go through all of them. That's just the one I was most recently reading, but it's neat stuff. It's really cool. Let's see. What in your opinion is the best book? Thank you for taking notes. My bad. Sorry for not typing there for a second. Was buying some tickets for an opening tonight. No problem, Louie. You're good. Wow, that looks nice. And then I shared the links. Thank you for the links. Absolutely. Yeah, I think links go a long way. I'm all about sharing resources. And I think that's one of the things that I find frustrating with some people that get into New Age spirituality is they get all excited about it, but then they try to lord information over other people. Like, I know this and you don't. I know this, you don't yet. This is the sources of where I learned it from. So if you want to go learn it, here's some sources to go read it and check it out. That's how you act in a community, in a society, right? You share. I got stuff from somewhere. Sometimes it's hearsay, and I'll tell you that. Sometimes it's my opinion, and I'll tell you that too. But other times, it's off of websites and books, and sometimes those sources are great, and sometimes they're not. But you deserve to have the same sources I looked up and make up your own mind. I has a bucket is a cool website. Okay. So yeah, I think we hit our 51-minute mark, which is typically when I end the live. I don't want to just cut the live off here. I thought this was a great conversation and enjoyable to talk about, so I'll probably give a title to this discussion. Not sure what I'm going to give this title to this discussion, but it'll stay in my live. So if you want to look up the links again, or if you didn't write the links down, you can go check it out later. Feel free to watch it again all the way through. Let it play in the background. Put comments. If you watch and interact, you tell me you like my content, so I'll make more. And if you don't, I'll probably make more anyway, because I'm a stubborn pain in the butt. That's just how I am. I like what I do. I like teaching, and this is the closest I'm probably going to get to teaching, and teaching something that I have a lot of joy for. So any last comments, questions that anyone wants to bring up or talk about before we end the live? So I don't want to just end it off. You know, I should brush out my beard before I get on my live. I've got like from sleeping on my pillow, this side's like crushed, and then this side's all poofy. We need to make poofier beards for live streams. Yes, check out I has a bucket. Not right now, but thank you for the suggestion and offer. I will definitely check it out later, because I know you, Rookie, and I know that you like to tease and troll sometimes. I have a feeling you're setting up a trap for me, so I'm going to wait. But thank you for the suggested website. I will check it out later, just not on this live. Any other final thoughts? It is a trap. I knew it. I knew it. But you are new here. Cool. Well, as always, thank you all for hanging out. May your path be a fruitful one, and remember, share sources, because they're awesome. It's a website with a single picture. I'm not surprised. I have watched you for a couple of years. Think you're great. Well, thank you, Laura. I really appreciate that. When you've made videos for as long as I have and you have low interaction, it becomes discouraging sometimes. So when individuals like yourself take the time to thank and appreciate for making content, that genuinely means a lot to me. So thank you for saying so. I really do appreciate that. A cute one. The website with the single picture? Yeah, it's definitely a trap. Cool. On that note, like I said, have a good one. And this will pop up under my live section for later. I do want to try to continue to regularly do lives at 2 Eastern time on Saturdays. We will see how long I can keep up with them. Hopefully the next one I can announce. Check out my community tab, and maybe I'll put up some votes for people to choose future topics. Yeah, you take care too. See y'all later.